What is the scariest noise you've ever heard? My friend was fatally shot in the chest when we were leaving a club together in 2016. We were drunk and didn't really realize what happened, but when the reality of the situation set in, the look of fear in her eyes is an image I'll never be able to forget. She started frantically grabbing at her heart and crying, "I don't want to die," in between gurgled breaths. Moments before she passed, she started convulsing and making these primordial sounding squelching noises that haunt me in my sleep to this day. She was 21. I miss her every day. I've heard some stuff to scare me, like being in the woods at night and bearing coyotes around me like surround sound. The worst happened this past Sunday. I took my daughter to a park that has some hiking trails, and at the end was going to let her play on the playground equipment. As we are finishing on the final mile-long trail, I kept hearing noises of some kids throwing rocks into a dry creek bed, but didn't see them. As we came to an incline with some exposed roots, I asked her to hold my hand to help give her some stability. Just as she moved forward and grabbed my hand, I heard the sound of a rock hitting the trail about 2 feet behind us, and as I looked back, saw what was probably a 5 or 6 pound rock bounding into the brush to the right of us. I looked up to make sure nothing else was coming and sped up. I yelled something along the lines of whatever stupid freaks were throwing rocks. They were landing on a trail and nearly hit someone. Had the rock hit my daughter or myself in the head, it would have killed her, and either killed or really hurt me, and then my 3-year-old would be alone hoping someone else came along on the trail. Once we got to the playground at the end of the trail, I called the rangers and told them what happened. Within 5 minutes of me calling, a ranger was at the 2 entrances/exits to the trail. Once I was leaving my friend's house after a big barbecue party, backing up my car very slowly, keeping a close eye on all the children running around the yard. My husband, who had arrived in a different vehicle and so wasn't in the car with me, thought it would be funny to walk up the side window and slap the glass. I was looking over my shoulder at that moment and didn't see him coming. For one horrible second I thought the noise of the slap was the sound of me running over a toddler. I slammed on the brake and started screaming before I realized what had happened. The terror was so strong that, even though it only lasted a second, I couldn't stop crying for like 10 minutes. My husband felt real bad. One night I woke up at 2 AM in a hot sweat, feeling thirsty. I went over to the kitchen to grab myself some water, and as I passed my parents' room I heard the most bone-chilling sounds of my entire life. It was the sound of my father moaning. The sound resembled the desperate shriek of an injured dog. It was a pitch I never thought his vocal cords could produce, but was undeniably him. I froze immediately, and my eyes opened up wide. I quickly covered my ears and fast walked right back into my room with my heart racing. I put on my headphones and blasted some music. I didn't leave my room till it was morning. I can't describe it, but my parents aren't openly affectionate towards each other, and hearing them go at it is a different kind of stomach-turning horror. I live on the edge of a small rural town, so it's not uncommon to encounter animals here, but many of them are still too spooked to venture in from the wilds this far. One night, I was just watching some movie in the living room. The doors and windows were open, and I heard a woman scream. It was high-pitched, blood-curdling. I ran outside with my rifle, trying not to look as frightened as I was, and there I saw nothing. Just the tree line in the darkness. I looked around for a while, and went back inside, starting to question whether or not I heard it at all. 5 minutes later I hear it again, and run back outside. I forgot to grab my rifle this time though, and was cursing myself as I approached the tree line again. But this time, I saw who made it, a goddamn owl. It looked at me, floofed up its feathers and made the same sound. Owls typically don't want much to do with people, but on the rare occasion I've seen one in town, it's been the hoo-hoo kind. This bad boy sounded like a poor woman getting necked by a slasher. I felt pretty relieved. Pretty dumb too. An approaching earthquake. I was in the Seattle for both the Maury Island and Nisqually quakes, 1995 and 2001, respectively. Both sounded like a distant freight train barreling down on us at top speed. Just this deep low growl that shifted into a roar coming through the ground. Mid-roar was when the shaking started. The Maury Island quake was short and shallow. The Nisqually quake, I was in the SODO district of Seattle, and I remember that after the worst of the shaking stopped, the ground was still moving like a liquid. That was uncanny. But that sound, it's like nothing else. I was shot at once, and the sound of a bullet passing close by is pretty distinctive, but I didn't realize what had happened until later, so I wasn't actually frightened by it. The most terrified I've been from a sound was when I was working graveyard security at an old army fort converted into a school. Part of the job was to walk through the buildings every hour or so and check the doors that are supposed to be locked. During one check I stopped midway to use the bathroom, and while I was washing my hands I heard a sound part way between a moan and roar. That was exactly the sound you'd expect some shambling and dead monstrosity to make, and it came from right outside the bathroom door. I stood there frozen in terror for a good 5 minutes, still holding a paper towel. When I didn't hear any other sounds, I turned the lights off to get accustomed to the dark, slowly opened the door, and sprinted for the exit. I didn't go in another building the rest of the night. 2 days later I was back for a day shift on the weekend. I'd had some time to consider what had happened, so I went back to the same bathroom and flushed the toilet. A minute later, the old water pipes made the same noise again. In my early 20s, I worked at a nuclear power plant in the laundry department, and there was an alarm for a nuclear event while I was on shift. All non-essential personnel had to take shelter in the on-site bunker and wait 4 hours. The speakers blared an alarm and notice inside and out of the complex. The notice was something akin to alert. Nuclear event in progress. Take your stations. Alert. Powers. The sound on its own wasn't actually scary. It was the fact that it came from the middle of my room, in the dark, and it sounded like a person making a popping sound with their lips. I was trying to convince myself that I imagined it. Then I tried to make the same sound to see if I could. I did. And then I heard it again, like an answer. Yeah, 10-year-old me was scared less by that. I still have no idea what that was or where it came from. The thunk of a car hitting my sister and the noise she made as she hit the pavement. Truly the most pants-shitting level of terror I've experienced, and that's a deep well to draw from. She survived after resuscitation. Don't drive drunk. Someone moving downstairs when I knew for a fact none else should be home. Ultimately more a sad story than a scary story, but when I was a teenager, my parents went to visit family out of town and let me do my thing at home for a few days. Unfortunately my mom got a call that grandpa had died, so they returned early and in the middle of the night. But instead of calling ahead or ringing the doorbell and just waking me up, they decided the best course of action would be to just let me have some sleep and then tell me in the morning. Needless to say, I was almost scared to death when I got up in the morning and heard someone downstairs and the door opening and closing when I thought I was home alone. My grandmother had an epileptic seizure, and in the 2 seconds leading up to her collapsing she screamed. It was a scream that sounded like she'd just witnessed the most horrible thing in the world. I've forgotten exactly why she screamed, but a doctor said it was just like an involuntary reaction. Still scary as hell. Way back in the 1980s, when I was in the Navy, my ship was down at the Guantanamo Naval Base for training. One day we were out at sea doing underway replenishments alongside an aircraft carrier. During this exercise the two ships would sail side by side on the same course, very close together, and rigs lines and hoses between the two ships to transfer fuel and other supplies. It's some dangerous mess. Every time our two ships would come together and get lines passed to the other ship, a Russian trawler would come diddy-bopping along right between the two ships, forcing us due to an emergency breakaway. This happened repeatedly all morning. At lunchtime both ships took a break. The aircraft carrier also launched 4 F-14s. After lunch we started up again, got lines and hoses passed, and once again the Russian trawler came up between us. Once again we did another emergency breakaway, but this time, the 4 F-14s came roaring out of the clouds, one after another, afterburners fired up, and all four went supersonic just over the trawler. I'm insufficiently eloquent to convey to you what it sounded like. The roar of the F-14's engines, flying at maybe 80 feet and no more than 25 yards away, was like the gates of hell had opened up, and every tortured soul howled in anguish at the same time. In the midst of this horrific screaming were 4 thunderous booms, one after the other. It sounded like the world was coming apart. It was mayhem. The guys on the carrier knew this was coming. The guys on our ship did not. People screamed and dove for cover. People pissed themselves. Some shat themselves. I nearly dove overboard looking for some cover from the god-awful noise. The trawler turned and disappeared over the horizon behind us at flank speed, and we never saw him again. I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere outside of Breckenridge, CO on vacation. It was about a 30-minute drive into town, so it was not close to anything really. On our last night, starting at about 2 AM there was a consistent, very loud bang that I can only imagine was a gunshot that sounded like it was directly outside the house. Not like someone hunting in the distance, but someone shooting very very close. The scary part was the direction the sound came from, and distance would rotate and seem to change distance that someone on foot couldn't do. It usually takes a lot for me to get spooked, but I was freaking terrified. If something were to happen where I was, that would be it. It continued on until early morning, and I got no sleep. I checked the property for footprints the next day and there was nothing. To this day, the only logical explanation I can think of was that it was gunshots very far away, but because of the acoustics of the mountain and valley, it just seemed close. No idea what it was though, but I'll remember it forever.